book 18 of 2020 was The Book Thief by Markus Zusak. So I was tasked to read this for a bonus book club because we'd read The Messenger at a book club, which is Markus Zusak's other book, which you can see a review of in my videos. And this had been on my shelf for such a long time because I've had so many people tell me that this is a good book, and it's, you know, it's revered by so many people like that say that it's really good and that it's really sad and whatever. So I was looking forward to reading it, although I had read like The Tattoo of Auschwitz, and so I was kind of a bit like, oh, I don't really want to read another, you know, history war like concentration camp kind of, you know, book, but because it was a bonus book club I kind of read it and I really enjoyed it. I really do recommend to read it because it's interesting. Markus Zusak in The Messenger had a really kind of weak characterisation, whereas in this one the characterisation was amazing. It was so well done, and it was strange because it didn't, like, because the story takes so long to tell. Like when you're first reading it, it's not very gripping and it's not kind of like, oh, I want to read it, but you kind of just with the characters and you kind of just find out about them and their lives, and it's kind of really kind of banal stuff. It's not like massively interesting. You just find out about what they're doing with the day because, you know, the kids. And it's funny actually because I didn't realise that this was written for children, and afterwards I kind of thought, oh, actually now I can kind of see why it was aimed at children. But when I was, you know, reading it initially, I was kind of like just taking it as just a story. What was I saying? So yeah, you find out like about these characters, and you find out little things about them, so that when they die, because obviously everyone dies, it's the war. It's like Nazi Germany, of course everyone dies. When they die, you just feel so bereft. You feel like you've lost your friends and people that you love because you know them so well and you know little bits about them. And I literally at the end of this book was sobbing my eyes out for like the last hour of reading the book, and when I closed the book and finished it, I felt really sad for like half an hour afterwards, an hour afterwards, and I was just like, that's just so sad. Like I felt like I'd lost like people, like and I kind of was thinking about my own like friends and them dying, and it was horrible. So the book essentially is about Liesel, who is a little girl, and her mother takes her to a couple to look after her. I think she pays them because I think her husband's been taken away because he's a communist, and I think she disappears. I'm probably giving lots of spoilers here, sorry. I was realising that just after I'd said it, but it happens quite at the beginning. She kind of disappears, so she's with these kind of like this man and woman who she doesn't really know, and it's all about kind of her relationship with them and how they become her mum and dad and how close she becomes with them. And it's really interesting because most books kind of they don't really ever show what it's like to live as a German in Germany during the war, because obviously we're in England and a lot of it's kind of quite ethnocentric, so it's kind of like all from the bias of England and, you know, the winners of the war, if you will. And it's funny because naive people usually are kind of like, oh, Germans are different, Germans are evil and this and that, and they did the war and whatever. And what people don't realise is that they were under a totalitarian regime. They were under Nazi Germany. They couldn't do anything against the regime because they would be killed themselves. Like, you know, it's funny because there's a character called Papa who he wants to protest against what they're making him do, and he does small acts of kind of like kindness, and he gets heavily beaten and reprimanded for it, and there's massive consequences to his behaviour, but it's almost kind of like that will to do the right thing, and he can't quite like prevent himself from helping others because that's just who he is as a person. Like he wants to, you know, do something, and everybody around him is kind of like not acting and not doing what the right thing is. But it kind of made me think about how even though everybody isn't doing anything, it doesn't mean that they agree with it. You know, it's kind of it's conformity, isn't it, where people go along with it, but it doesn't mean that they actually agree with what is happening. And you see this a lot in groups of people, that, you know, everyone seems to be doing the same behaviour, but actually if one person's, you know, spoke up and said, actually I don't want to do it like this, or I want to do it a different way, most people would agree. It's just that they don't kind of speak up. It's not kind of, you know, a pro-social way to behave, I guess. And so it was a really interesting perspective of what life was like for a German in Nazi Germany. And I think it's really, really useful as a book for younger audience, because they will then understand it in you know, with more empathy. Because, you know, we have a lot of literature from, you know, for example, Anne Frank's diary of being a Jew in Germany, and how horrifically that she was treated, and her family was treated, and all Jewish people were treated, and anybody who was, you know, part of Hitler's final solution. But it's a good perspective of what it was like for people in Germany who kind of went along with those acts but didn't actually agree with them. There's also a nice kind of element in there where Liesel becomes friends with a Jew, and they've developed such a beautiful friendship, and it kind of throws into stark contrast what Jews are perceived as by everyone in the town and by Hitler and the regime, and what this person's actually like. It's kind of a humanisation of someone who's Jewish, and it just kind of shows like the absurdity of antisemitism, and how everyone's a human being and should be treated as such, and how, you know, just somebody's words can make people hate other people. And Zusak's really good at being quite philosophical in his writing. He did it in his Messenger, and he's done it in this one as well, where he is kind of alluding to a lot of kind of things. You know, there's quite an emphasis on this words, and I kind of thought that was interesting, because it's like the words that you use have the ability to harm another person. They have the ability to make someone behave in a way that harms another person. And so it was kind of a way of like thinking, you know, be careful with your words. So I kind of liked that. There's quite successful framing as well. So there's death as like an omniscient narrator, which kind of adds some perspective onto Liesel's life, and kind of adds that kind of dichotomy between hers and their story, his story. I think it's a he, but it's laboured at times, so it could do with like not being done as much, I think. Zusak is also really creative with his visual metaphors. This was something that I picked up on in his other book as well, The Messenger, because it personifies the prose. And it's funny actually, because I'm reading another book called Where the Crawdads Sing, and that writer does it as well. And the other book I'm reading as well is called Shatter Me, and that one does it as well. And I'm like, is this something now that everyone's like starting to write like with these kind of metaphors? Because it's funny, because they work sometimes, but other times, like paradoxically, it makes it more confusing. So at one point, Zusak was saying like that this person's eyes were like swampy eyes, and I was like, what on earth is a swampy eye? Like, does that mean it's deep? Does that mean it's dark? Does that mean it's green? Does that mean it's muddy? Like, what does that mean? I was like imagining like the Demon Headmaster eyes, or like Salvador Dali, you know, surrealist eyes. Like, what does that even mean? So some of the metaphors that were used were really confusing, and didn't help me to visualise what was being discussed. So that was kind of, you know, a little bit hit and miss, I think. But as I mentioned before, really, really good characterisation, and I enjoyed reading the book for getting to know the characters. It was quite difficult to get through initially, because like I mentioned before, you've got to kind of like, it's got to set everything up. So, and it's quite a big book, so you know, it could probably benefit from being a little bit shorter, but I think you needed that expanse to be able to build up the characterisation, so it's probably necessary. So I gave it a 4 stars, just simply because it really affected me emotionally with the characters, and it gave that kind of different perspective to Nazi Germany, but it has got issues with it in terms of the metaphors and the framing.